December 1948, Berlin. Margarete Hoffman stood in her apartment wearing 3 coats, watching her breath form clouds in the frozen air. The thermometer outside her shattered window read -15 degrees Celsius. In the corner of her kitchen, her 2 children huddled beneath every blanket the family owned, their lips tinged blue. The small coal stove that had kept them alive through previous winters sat cold and empty. There was no fuel. There had been no fuel for weeks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had heard the rumors, whispers passed between desperate neighbors in the breadlines. The Americans were coming. Not with tanks this time, but with something the survivors of this destroyed city needed far more desperately than they had ever needed liberation. They were bringing coal. Flying it in, they said. Thousands upon thousands of tons, delivered by the same aircraft that had dropped bombs just 3 years earlier. Marguerite dismissed it as fantasy. No nation would undertake such an effort for former enemies. No country possessed the capacity to sustain an entire city through the air. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. Yet on that frozen December morning, she heard them. A deep rumbling that started as a distant thunder and grew into a constant roar that shook the remaining glass in her windows. She pulled aside the frost-covered curtain and looked up into the gray Berlin sky. What she saw would shatter every assumption she had carried about the nation that had defeated hers, about the limits of human capability, and about whether enemies could ever truly become something else. Aircraft. Not dozens, not hundreds, but a seemingly endless stream of transport planes, one after another, their silver bellies catching what little winter light penetrated the clouds. They came in such numbers that the sound never stopped, a mechanical heartbeat pumping life back into a city the world had written off as dead. She watched one descend toward Tempelhof Airport, so close she could see the American markings on its wings. Behind it, another appeared, and another, and another. The sky had become a conveyor belt of aluminum and hope. Marguerite had been taught that Americans were soft, that their democracy made them weak, that their mixed society would crumble under pressure. She had believed it because everyone around her had believed it, because the state had proclaimed it with such certainty that questioning seemed absurd. Now she stood in her frozen apartment, watching an armada of American planes bringing salvation to the city that had once celebrated their destruction, and she felt the foundations of everything she had known beginning to crack. The story of what happened in Berlin between June 1948 and May 1949 would become one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of logistical capability, political resolve, and humanitarian commitment. It began not with American benevolence, but with Soviet aggression. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces blockaded all ground access to West Berlin, cutting off rail lines, roads, and canals that connected the western sectors of the city to the outside world. 2.5 million civilians found themselves trapped in a city still largely reduced to rubble, with food supplies sufficient for 36 days and coal reserves that would last 45. The Soviet calculation seemed straightforward. Winter was coming. The western sectors of Berlin could not be supplied by air. The civilian population would freeze and starve unless the Western Allies abandoned the city. Within weeks, perhaps months, the Americans, British, and French would have no choice but to withdraw, and Berlin would fall completely under Soviet control. It was, by conventional military and logistical assessment, an unbeatable strategy. There was simply no precedent for supplying a major city entirely by air. The largest airlift in history to that point had been the Burma airlift during World War II, which at its peak had delivered roughly 6,000 tons per month. Berlin would require a minimum of 4,000 tons per day just to prevent starvation, and closer to 8,000 tons daily to maintain anything approaching normal function during winter. The numbers seemed to make Soviet victory inevitable. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of occupied Germany, disagreed. On June 25, one day after the blockade began, he authorized the start of what would officially be designated Operation Vittles, though the British component would be named Operation Planefare. The initial assessment from Air Force planners was sobering. Current transport capacity in Europe could perhaps deliver 700 tons daily. That figure would keep people alive, barely, but would provide nothing for heating, manufacturing, or maintaining the basic infrastructure of urban life. Berlin would survive, but barely, and only until winter truly set in. Clay's response was simple: increase capacity. What followed was one of the most dramatic logistical mobilizations in peacetime history. Within 72 hours of the blockade's start, the United States began redeploying transport aircraft from around the world to bases in Western Germany. C-47 Skytrains arrived first, the workhorse cargo planes that had dropped paratroopers over Normandy. They could carry 3 tons per flight. Then came the C-54 Skymasters 4-engine transports capable of hauling 10 tons of cargo. Airfields at Rhein-Main and Wiesbaden became staging grounds for an operation that would ultimately involve aircraft departing for Berlin every 90 seconds at peak operation. For the civilians of Berlin, the transformation happened with stunning speed. Margarete Hoffman, whose perspective we began with, experienced it as a transition from despair to disbelief. On June 23rd, she had walked to the market and purchased coal from rapidly dwindling stockpiles using her ration cards. On June 24th, the blockade began and the city administration announced severe rationing of all supplies. By June 27th, just 3 days later, she heard the first American transport planes overhead. Within a week, the sound had become constant. Her initial reaction mirrored that of most Berliners: relief mixed with skepticism. The planes were coming, yes, but surely this was a temporary measure. Surely the Western allies were negotiating with the Soviets. Surely some diplomatic solution would reopen the ground routes before winter. The idea that an entire city could be supplied by air for months seemed like a fantasy born of desperation. The logistical realities appeared insurmountable. Food alone presented staggering challenges, but coal was something else entirely. The western sectors of Berlin required approximately 6,000 tons of coal daily during winter months just for heating and basic industry. Coal is heavy, bulky, and dirty. Loading it into aircraft designed for precision cargo seemed almost perversely inefficient. Yet the Americans and British began doing exactly that. At Rhein-Main and other Western air bases, ground crews developed systems for rapid loading. Canvas sacks, each containing roughly 100 pounds of coal, were pre-loaded onto pallets. Forklifts moved these pallets into the cargo bays of waiting aircraft. Loading times dropped from over an hour to less than 30 minutes. The aircraft would take off, fly the corridor to Berlin, land at Tempelhof, Gatow, or eventually Tegel, unload in minutes, and return for another load. At peak efficiency, the same aircraft could complete 3 round trips per day. The civilians watching this operation unfold began to grasp that something unprecedented was happening. Franz Müller, a former engineer whose factory had been destroyed in the bombing, started keeping detailed records of aircraft movements. He positioned himself near Tempelhof and counted. On July 1st, he recorded 68 landings. By July 15th, the number had climbed to 132. On August 10th, he counted 219 aircraft landing at Tempelhof alone, not including operations at other Berlin airfields. His notebooks, preserved in Berlin museums, document the escalation with almost obsessive precision. Müller had worked in logistics before the war. He understood supply chains, transportation capacity, and industrial coordination. What he was witnessing violated every principle he had been taught about practical limitations. The scale was impossible, yet it was happening. He calculated tonnage based on aircraft types and frequency. By his estimates, the Americans and British were delivering over 3,000 tons daily by mid-August. That figure would prove conservative. Official records show that by autumn 1948, daily deliveries exceeded 4,000 tons, and by spring 1949, the airlift was consistently delivering over 8,000 tons per day.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The personal experience of receiving aid from former enemies created profound psychological effects. Helga Schneider, a widow whose husband had died fighting Americans in France, recorded her feelings in a diary that she maintained throughout the blockade. Her early entries reflect the confused emotional state many Berliners experienced. She had lost her husband to American soldiers. Her apartment had been damaged by American bombs. American occupation had brought restrictions and denazification proceedings that had cost her father his position as a school administrator. She had every reason to view Americans with bitterness. Yet here they were, flying constantly overhead, bringing the coal that kept her children from freezing. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed her initially. She couldn't reconcile her grief and resentment with her desperate gratitude. Her diary entries from July 1948 reflect this confusion, veering between criticism of American occupation policies and acknowledgement that without American aircraft, her family would not survive. By August, her tone began shifting. She wrote about watching American ground crews at Tempelhof, working in brutal heat to unload coal. These were young men, boys really, who could have been relaxing at home in America. Instead, they were laboring to save Germans who had tried to kill them just 3 years earlier. The operation's scale became more visible as infrastructure expanded. Tempelhof Airport, massive but insufficient for the operation's needs, underwent rapid expansion. German civilians were hired to extend runways, build loading facilities, and improve approach systems. They worked alongside American and British engineers, experiencing firsthand the organizational methods and technological capabilities of their former enemies. The construction techniques alone provided education. Americans used earth-moving equipment that could do in hours what would have required days of manual labor. Concrete was poured with industrial efficiency. Electrical systems and lighting arrays went up at speeds that seemed impossible to Germans accustomed to wartime scarcity and post-war chaos. But Tempelhof's limitations remained. The airport sat in the middle of a densely populated urban area, surrounded by apartment buildings that created dangerous approach corridors. Aircraft had to descend at steep angles, threading between buildings with minimal margin for error. In fog or storms, operations became extremely hazardous. The solution was to build a new airport from scratch. In September 1948, French forces occupying their sector of Berlin began construction of Tegel Airport in just 90 days. What would normally require years of planning and construction was completed in 3 months. 5,000 German workers and French engineers transformed an empty field into a functional airport, with a runway capable of handling the largest transport aircraft in the Allied inventory. The construction of Tegel became a spectacle that drew crowds of German civilians. They came to watch American machinery tear through obstacles. They observed French engineers implementing designs with remarkable speed. They saw coordination between Allied forces that operated with an efficiency their own military had supposedly perfected. The Reich had prided itself on organizational superiority, on precision planning and execution. Yet here were the supposedly chaotic democracies accomplishing in months what German planning might have taken years to execute, and doing it while simultaneously running the largest airlift in history. Margarete Hoffman, whose frozen morning we began with, obtained work at Tempelhof, helping to sort supplies. The job provided income, additional food rations, and something equally valuable in that desperate time: purpose. Each day she reported to the airport and worked alongside hundreds of other German civilians unloading American aircraft. The work was brutal. Coal dust covered everything. The heavy sacks strained backs and shoulders. Winter cold made the labor even more miserable. Yet she found herself grateful for it. Not just for the wages, though those mattered desperately, but for the glimpse it provided into the system keeping her city alive. She watched American pilots, many barely out of their teens, flying missions in weather that kept German civilians indoors. She observed ground crews working 18-hour shifts to maintain aircraft that were being pushed far beyond normal operational limits. She saw the coordination, aircraft landing every few minutes around the clock, with ground crews loading and unloading with mechanical precision. The whole operation functioned like an enormous machine, each part synchronized with every other part. Delays were measured in minutes, not hours. Inefficiency was identified and eliminated immediately. Problems were solved in real time rather than referred up command chains for decision. This practical efficiency contradicted everything she had been taught about American capabilities. The propaganda had portrayed Americans as undisciplined, their mixed society incapable of the focus and coordination that German culture supposedly provided. Yet here was evidence of organizational capacity that exceeded anything she had witnessed during the war years, when Germany's vaunted efficiency had supposedly been at its peak. The Americans weren't just matching German capabilities. They were exceeding them while simultaneously maintaining operations around the globe, supporting an economy that provided their citizens with prosperity Germans couldn't imagine, and doing it all within a democratic framework that supposedly made such achievements impossible. The food supplies arriving alongside the coal told their own story. Dehydrated potatoes, powdered milk, flour, dried eggs, and other concentrated foods arrived in carefully calculated quantities. Nutrition experts had determined optimal caloric and vitamin requirements. Logistics officers had calculated transport efficiency for different food types. The result was a scientifically designed supply system that maintained population health with minimal transport weight. Even the food itself represented capabilities Germans lacked. Dehydration and preservation technologies, quality control systems, and industrial food processing all reflected a sophisticated infrastructure that operated at scales Germans were only beginning to comprehend. Winter arrived early in 1948. By November, temperatures had dropped below freezing and stayed there. Snow and ice made flying treacherous. Fog reduced visibility to near zero on many days. This was the moment Soviet planners had anticipated. Surely the airlift would falter. Surely the Allies would acknowledge the impossibility of maintaining supply through winter weather. Instead, operations intensified. New navigation systems were installed. Ground control approach radar allowed planes to land in conditions that would have grounded all traffic previously. Aircraft were modified with improved de-icing equipment. Maintenance schedules were adjusted to account for cold weather impacts. The airlift didn't slow, it accelerated. On Christmas Day 1948, the airlift achieved what became known as the Christmas Miracle. In 24 hours, Allied aircraft delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies to Berlin, setting a single-day record that demonstrated the operation's full capability. German civilians who had expected the airlift to collapse under winter conditions instead witnessed its triumph. Churches across Berlin held special services acknowledging the miracle they were witnessing. Not a religious miracle, though many certainly prayed, but a miracle of human capability, of industrial might applied to humanitarian purpose, of former enemies choosing to save rather than destroy. Helga Schneider attended Christmas services at a damaged church near her apartment. The pastor, a man who had lost 2 sons in the war, spoke about the meaning of what they were experiencing. He avoided politics, as clergy in occupied Berlin had to, but he talked about witnessing grace, about the possibility of redemption, about enemies becoming something else through acts that transcended hatred. Helga wrote in her diary that night that she wept during the service, not from grief this time, but from a confused gratitude she was only beginning to understand. The Americans bringing coal to Berlin weren't monsters or demons. They were young men doing difficult work to save people who had been their enemies. That simple truth was demolishing the worldview she had carried since childhood. The technical achievements underlying the airlift became more apparent as German civilians observed operations closely. Radio navigation beacons guided aircraft along precise corridors. Radar systems tracked every flight, maintaining separation and sequence. Weather forecasting had become sophisticated enough to predict conditions hours in advance, allowing operational adjustments. Maintenance protocols kept aircraft flying despite usage rates that would normally ground fleets for repairs. Every aspect of the operation reflected technological and organizational capabilities that Germans were only beginning to recognize. Franz Müller, the engineer who had been counting aircraft, managed to tour Tempelhof's operations center. What he saw there confirmed his evolving understanding. Americans had created a system that operated with industrial precision. Flight schedules, loading sequences, maintenance rotations, and supply calculations were all coordinated through a central operations room that looked more like a factory floor than a military command post. Officers and enlisted men worked side by side with civilian contractors. Decisions were made based on data rather than rank. Problems were solved through systematic analysis rather than hierarchical approval processes. The entire approach to organization differed fundamentally from German military tradition. Müller recognized that he was witnessing not just a logistical achievement, but a different way of organizing human effort. The Americans weren't relying on individual brilliance or heroic effort, though both were certainly present. Instead, they had created systems that functioned reliably regardless of individual performance. The system was designed for ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results through coordination and method rather than exceptional ability or sacrifice. This systematic approach to organization, he realized, was itself a form of technology as important as any machinery. The coal that arrived in those aircraft transformed daily life in ways that extended beyond merely preventing freezing. Coal meant electricity for the few functioning power plants. Electricity meant lighting, refrigeration, and the ability to operate what little industry still functioned. Coal meant heat for schools, allowing children to attend classes even in winter. Coal meant hospitals could maintain temperatures necessary for patient care. Each ton of coal multiplied into countless downstream effects that maintained civilization in a besieged city. German civilians began calculating what the airlift represented in practical terms. The mathematics were staggering. At peak operation, Allied aircraft were delivering over 8,000 tons daily. Over 9 months, that totaled over 2.3 million tons of supplies, of which roughly 1.5 million tons was coal. The tonnage by itself barely captured the achievement. More meaningful was what it represented in flights, in pilot hours, in ground crew labor, in maintenance, in coordination, in sustained effort day after day for nearly a year. The operation required approximately 278,000 total flights. Aircraft were landing in Berlin every 90 seconds at peak times. The system operated continuously, 24 hours daily, regardless of weather, holidays, or any other consideration. The human cost of maintaining such operations became visible to German civilians working at the airports. They witnessed exhausted pilots climbing from cockpits after multiple flights in difficult conditions. They saw maintenance crews working through nights to keep aircraft flying. They observed the toll that such sustained effort took on the young men executing it. 39 British and American airmen died in crashes during the airlift. German civilians attended memorial services for men who had died bringing them coal and food. The paradox of mourning enemy soldiers who had become saviors was not lost on anyone. The spring of 1949 brought a transformation that went beyond mere survival. Berlin was not just enduring, it was beginning to function again. The psychological shift among civilians reflected this change. What had begun as desperate gratitude evolved into something more complex. Germans were not just receiving aid. They were participating in their own rescue, working alongside the very people who had bombed their city into rubble just years before. Klaus Werner had been a Luftwaffe mechanic during the war, servicing the fighters that had battled American bombers over German skies. His technical expertise, which might have made him unemployable in the suspicious atmosphere of denazification, instead became valuable when Allied forces needed German mechanics to help maintain the aircraft fleet sustaining the airlift. He found himself hired at Tempelhof, working on the same C-54 Skymasters he had once hoped to see shot down. The irony was not lost on him. His first day on the job, he stood beside an American crew chief who patiently explained the maintenance protocols for the Wright R2000 engines powering the transport. The American was perhaps 10 years younger than Klaus, probably hadn't even finished school when Klaus was already flying combat missions. Yet here was this young man, teaching him procedures and techniques that revealed a sophistication Klaus had never encountered in Luftwaffe operations. The maintenance manuals alone astonished him. Every procedure was documented with precision that bordered on obsessive. Torque specifications for every bolt. Inspection intervals calculated to the hour. Replacement schedules based on statistical analysis rather than intuition or experience. The Americans approached aircraft maintenance as an engineering discipline rather than a mechanical craft. The maintenance manuals alone astonished him. Every procedure was documented with precision that bordered on obsessive. Torque specifications for every bolt. Inspection intervals calculated to the hour. Replacement schedules based on statistical analysis rather than intuition or experience. The Americans approached aircraft maintenance as an engineering discipline rather than a mechanical craft.
Klaus had been trained to fix problems as they arose, to use skill and judgment to keep aircraft flying. The Americans prevented problems through systematic procedures that eliminated judgment from routine operations. What struck him most forcefully was the waste. The Americans replaced parts that still had functional life remaining. Components that Klaus would have repaired and reused were simply discarded and swapped with new units. His training screamed against such inefficiency. Resources were precious. Equipment should be used until exhausted, repaired until unrepairable, hoarded against future scarcity. The American approach seemed almost criminally wasteful, until he began understanding the mathematics underlying their methods. An engine component might have 50 hours of useful life remaining when American protocols mandated replacement. But if that component failed in flight, the cost in lost aircraft, lost cargo, and potentially lost lives exceeded by orders of magnitude the expense of premature replacement. The Americans had calculated failure probabilities and determined that planned replacement before failure was economically optimal despite appearing wasteful. They were optimizing for system reliability rather than component utilization. It was an entirely different way of thinking about resource management, possible only for a nation with production capacity so vast that replacement parts were more abundant than the time required to repair originals. Klaus found himself learning not just maintenance procedures, but a fundamentally different approach to engineering and operations. German engineering had emphasized perfection. Each component should be crafted to the highest possible standard, built to last, maintained meticulously to extend service life indefinitely. American engineering emphasized different values. Components should be adequate for purpose, produced rapidly in vast quantities, replaced before failure rather than maintained to exhaustion. Both approaches worked, but the American method proved far more scalable. You could train adequate mechanics much faster than master craftsmen. You could produce adequate components much faster than perfect ones. And in aggregate, a system of adequate components replaced before failure proved more reliable than perfect components maintained to exhaustion. The social interactions at Tempelhof revealed other differences that challenged Klaus's understanding. The American crew chief who supervised him, Sergeant James Morrison from Ohio, treated him as a colleague rather than a defeated enemy or inferior subordinate. Morrison asked Klaus's opinions on technical matters, deferred to his experience with certain engine types, and invited him to share meals with American personnel. This casual equality contradicted everything Klaus had been taught about racial and national hierarchy. Morrison's background, which he shared freely during lunch breaks, illustrated American social mobility that seemed almost fantastical to Klaus. Morrison's father had been a factory worker. Morrison himself had attended public school, learned mechanics in a vocational program, and joined the Air Force seeking better opportunities than his hometown provided. Now he supervised maintenance operations for an airlift supplying millions of people. His career trajectory from factory town to international operations had taken just a few years. In Germany, such mobility across social classes remained rare even before the war. The rigid class structures that defined German society simply didn't exist in the same way in America. The work itself created bonds that transcended nationality. When a C-54 developed engine trouble during landing and threatened to block Tempelhof's main runway, Klaus and Morrison worked together through the night to repair it. They diagnosed the problem, sourced replacement parts, installed them, and tested the repairs in time for morning operations to resume without interruption. The emergency created a shared experience that dissolved the abstraction of former enemies into the concrete reality of two mechanics solving a problem. Morrison thanked Klaus for his expertise. Klaus recognized that Morrison's systematic approach had made the repair possible despite time pressure. They had functioned as a team because the work demanded it and because both men approached it professionally rather than ideologically. Across Berlin, similar interactions were occurring thousands of times daily. German civilians worked at all three airports, in warehouses, on construction crews, and in administrative roles supporting the airlift. Each interaction provided opportunities for former enemies to encounter each other as individuals rather than abstractions. The cumulative effect of these micro-level encounters was profound. It became increasingly difficult to maintain hatred or ideological fervor when the objects of that hatred were exhausted young men working brutal hours to keep you alive. The children of Berlin experienced the airlift in ways that shaped their worldview for life. Greta Zimmermann was 8 years old when the blockade began. Her most vivid memories from early childhood involved sirens, bombs, flames consuming her neighborhood, and the grinding fear of adults around her. Americans had been the faceless enemy raining destruction from above. Then the blockade transformed them into something else entirely.
She remembered the candy. Allied pilots, particularly the Americans, began attaching small parachutes to candy bars and gum, dropping them during approach to Berlin airports. Children would gather near the airports, watching for the tiny parachutes that delivered chocolate, gum, and other treats that had become mythical in their deprivation. The pilots who initiated this, particularly Lieutenant Gail Halverson, who became known as the Candy Bomber, created a propaganda victory more powerful than any official program could achieve. The image of American pilots voluntarily sharing their rations with German children demolished years of indoctrination more effectively than any re-education program. Greta collected the parachutes, carefully preserving each one as treasures beyond price. But more than the candy itself, she remembered the realization it produced. The Americans flying overhead weren't monsters. They were people who cared that children were suffering and acted to relieve that suffering in whatever small ways they could manage. That simple recognition opened possibilities that Nazi ideology had closed. If Americans could be kind, if former enemies could become benefactors, if hatred could transform into humanity, then perhaps the future didn't have to replicate the past. Her parents initially discouraged her from gathering near the airport. They worried about her safety, about unexploded ordnance, about the crowds. But eventually, they recognized what the candy drops represented. Their daughter was learning that the world contained more possibilities than they had known. They stopped trying to protect her from that knowledge because they recognized it was the only real protection she would have in the devastated world Germany had created through its choices. The food supplied through the airlift introduced German civilians to American agricultural and industrial food production capabilities. Powdered milk, dried eggs, dehydrated potatoes, and instant coffee were novelties to most Germans. These foods represented not just different products, but different approaches to food production and preservation. The technologies enabling long-term food storage without refrigeration, the industrial processes that could produce food at massive scale, and the distribution systems that could deliver it worldwide all reflected capabilities German agriculture and industry lacked. Lieselot Baun worked in one of the distribution centers where arriving food supplies were sorted and allocated to Berlin's districts. Her job involved unpacking crates, checking contents against manifests, and organizing goods for redistribution. The experience provided detailed exposure to American food production. Each package carried labels indicating origin: wheat from Kansas, powdered milk from Wisconsin, dried fruit from California. The geographic span alone astonished her. Food was arriving from across an entire continent, collected through distribution networks that functioned efficiently enough to supply a blockaded city across an ocean. The quality control impressed her equally. Every package met standardized specifications. Contents matched labels precisely. Packages included preparation instructions, nutritional information, and handling guidelines. This systematization of food production reflected an approach to agriculture and industry that treated food as a manufacturing output rather than an agricultural product subject to natural variation. The Americans had industrialized food production in ways that guaranteed consistency and quality at massive scale. Lisa Lana's background as a teacher before the war had left her with an analytical mind that sought patterns and meanings. She began keeping records of food supplies, noting varieties, quantities, and origins. Her notebooks, preserved by her family, reveal the evolution of her thinking as patterns emerged. The abundance was not occasional or temporary, it was consistent and sustained. Week after week, month after month, food arrived in quantities that suggested the source was essentially unlimited. America appeared to produce food surpluses so vast that feeding 2.5 million blockaded Germans barely strained their capacity. She began discussing her observations with other workers at the distribution center. Together, they tried to comprehend the agricultural system that could produce such abundance. The numbers defied their understanding. Germany had been agriculturally self-sufficient before the war only through intensive cultivation of available land and significant imports from conquered territories. American agriculture apparently produced massive surpluses while using a fraction of available workforce because farming had been mechanized to a degree Germans found difficult to imagine. The propaganda films they had seen during the war portrayed America as a society weakened by internal divisions and corrupted by racial mixing. These films had focused on urban poverty, labor conflicts, and social problems to argue that democracy led inevitably to chaos. The food arriving daily argued otherwise. A chaotic, weakened society could not produce agricultural surpluses sufficient to feed much of Europe while maintaining domestic prosperity. The contradiction forced Lisa Lana to question everything she had been taught.
The coal deliveries created similar revelations about American industrial capacity. Werner Schultz had worked in the coal mines of the Ruhr Valley before the war, understanding from direct experience how much labor was required to extract and process coal. He now worked at Gatow Air Base, unloading the coal that arrived aboard British and American aircraft. Each plane carried approximately 10 tons. Calculating backward from daily tonnages, Werner could estimate total production feeding the airlift. The numbers staggered him. Germany had mobilized vast resources to maintain coal production during the war, using forced labor and depleting reserves to sustain both industrial production and domestic heating. Yet the Americans and British were diverting thousands of tons daily to supply Berlin, while presumably maintaining their own industrial operations and civilian comfort. The coal they were essentially gifting to Germans exceeded what German mines had produced even at peak wartime output. Either Allied propaganda about their coal production was accurate and German intelligence had been catastrophically wrong, or the airlift was somehow a propaganda show that would inevitably collapse. Month after month of sustained deliveries answered that question decisively. This was no show. The coal was real, arriving daily in quantities that demonstrated industrial capacity beyond German comprehension. Werner found himself recalculating everything he thought he knew about relative industrial capabilities. Germany had supposedly been the industrial heartland of Europe, the center of manufacturing excellence, the pinnacle of productive efficiency. Yet America was delivering more coal as charity to a blockaded enemy city than Germany had been able to produce for its own needs at the height of its power. The psychological impact of this realization extended beyond mere acknowledgement of defeat. Werner had to confront the possibility that everything he had believed about German superiority was fiction. If German industry had been superior, the airlift would be impossible. If German organization had been more efficient, they wouldn't need American assistance. If German culture had been more advanced, their country wouldn't be divided and occupied while they depend on charity from supposedly inferior peoples. The evidence arriving daily aboard American aircraft demolished the ideological foundations of everything he had been taught. The technical sophistication visible in airlift operations reinforced these conclusions. Radio navigation systems guided aircraft with precision German technology hadn't achieved operationally. Radar installations tracked flights in weather that would have grounded German operations entirely. Weather forecasting services predicted conditions with accuracy that enabled operational planning Germans considered impossible. Every technical system supporting the airlift demonstrated capabilities that exceeded German wartime achievements. Johann Richter had been a radio operator in the Wehrmacht, familiar with German communications technology and procedures. After the war, he found employment at Tempelhof working with Allied communication systems. The technological gap he discovered shocked him. German radio equipment had been adequate for its purposes, but remained fundamentally similar to technology from the 1930s. Allied equipment incorporated advances that moved communications into entirely new realms of capability. The radar systems particularly amazed him. Ground control approach radar could guide aircraft to landing in visibility so poor that pilots literally could not see the runway until moments before touchdown. This technology made operations possible in weather that would have completely halted German air operations. The implications extended beyond immediate tactical advantages. A nation that could develop and deploy such sophisticated electronics possessed scientific and industrial capabilities that Germany had never approached. Johann learned to operate this equipment, receiving training from British and American technicians who treated him as a student rather than a defeated enemy. The training itself revealed different approaches to technology and education. The instructors used systematic teaching methods, breaking complex systems into understandable components, building knowledge progressively from fundamentals to applications. German technical training had often emphasized rote memorization and procedure following. Allied training emphasized understanding principles so operators could adapt to novel situations. The cultural exchange worked both directions during these training sessions. Johann shared insights about German radio procedures and frequency management. Allied technicians acknowledged that German communications discipline during the war was excellent, noting that German operators had maintained professional standards even under devastating circumstances. This recognition of German professionalism within the context of overwhelming Allied technological superiority created a strange emotional space. Johann could maintain pride in his own competence while acknowledging that his nation's technology had been inferior. As spring progressed towards summer, the strategic situation became increasingly clear. The Soviet blockade had failed. Rather than starving Berlin into submission, the blockade had prompted the most successful airlift in history, demonstrating Allied capabilities so dramatically that the propaganda value to the West exceeded anything traditional military victory might have achieved. The Soviets had created a situation where the West could demonstrate its superiority through humanitarian action rather than military conflict. It was a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. On May 12, 1949, at 1 minute past midnight, the Soviet Union officially ended the blockade, reopening ground routes to Berlin. The decision came not from military defeat, but from recognition that continuation was pointless. The airlift had proven its capacity to sustain Berlin indefinitely. Allied aircraft had delivered supplies in ever-increasing tonnages as the operation matured. By the final months, daily deliveries sometimes exceeded 12,000 tons, far more than Berlin required. The Allies were stockpiling supplies in Berlin, demonstrating that the airlift could not only maintain the city, but actually build reserves for future contingencies. German civilians watching ground convoys enter Berlin after 11 months of blockade experienced complex emotions. Relief certainly dominated. The threat was ended. Normal supply routes were restored. Life could begin returning to something approaching peacetime conditions. But mixed with relief came other feelings that Germans struggled to articulate. Gratitude toward the Allies who had saved them. Resentment toward the Soviets who had tried to starve them. Confusion about what all of this meant for German identity and future. Margarete Hoffman stood at a window watching the first supply trucks roll through Berlin streets. Her children stood beside her, warmer than they had been in years because American coal had kept them alive through winter. She thought about the transformation she had experienced over the past 11 months. She had begun as a desperate civilian expecting abandonment. She had become a participant in her own rescue, working alongside young Americans who had every reason to hate her, but instead treated her with casual professionalism. She had witnessed capabilities that demolished every certainty she had carried from her previous life. What came next, she wondered. Germany lay divided and devastated, occupied by former enemies who were now revealed as possessors of power so overwhelming that resistance seemed absurd. Yet those same enemies had chosen to use their power to sustain life rather than inflict death. They had fed German children with candy dropped from aircraft that had once carried bombs. They had worked brutal hours to prevent Germans from freezing. They had demonstrated that the world contained possibilities beyond endless conflict. Her children would grow up in this new world, shaped by these experiences. They would remember American pilots and British air crews not as enemies but as saviors. They would know from direct experience that former enemies could become benefactors, that international cooperation could achieve what national ambition could not, that democracy and mixed societies possessed strengths that authoritarian ideologies denied. The future might still hold conflicts and challenges, but it would not simply replicate the past because her children and millions like them had witnessed alternatives to hatred and conquest. The airlift officially continued until September 30, 1949, even after ground routes reopened. The Allies wanted to demonstrate that the capability remained, that Berlin could be sustained by air if necessary, that the blockade strategy would not succeed even if attempted again. During those final months, the operation set additional records and refined procedures that would influence military logistics for decades. The final statistics captured the achievement's magnitude. Over the course of 15 months, Allied aircraft flew approximately 278,000 missions. They delivered roughly 2.3 million tons of supplies, of which approximately 1.5 million tons was coal. 39 airmen died in crashes during the operation. At peak operation, aircraft landed in Berlin every 90 seconds around the clock. The cost exceeded $224 million in 1949 currency, equivalent to billions in modern terms. Yet measured against the strategic and humanitarian stakes, the investment proved economically efficient. The airlift prevented Soviet expansion without military conflict, demonstrated Western capabilities more dramatically than combat could have achieved, and saved millions of civilians from starvation and freezing. For German civilians who lived through it, the airlift created a generation whose worldview was fundamentally shaped by the experience. They had witnessed the power of democratic societies applied to humanitarian purposes. They had worked alongside former enemies and discovered shared humanity beneath national and ideological divisions. They had seen that the future did not have to replicate the past, that different choices were possible, that redemption might follow even catastrophic mistakes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.